All right. Welcome to the NeuroTrition podcast. This is the podcast that focuses on helping you optimize both your mind and your body. And what I was hoping for this podcast to be is a little bit of an introduction to a exciting new program that we have in our office called Design Clinical Neurotrition. And for those of you who already know me or maybe already patients, you know that we have had something called Design Clinical Nutrition for quite a long time. And essentially, what Design Clinical Nutrition was is a functional medicine approach that went after getting down to the root causes of your healthcare symptoms. And that has become something that has been very important, especially, even before, but even um, especially since the pandemic, is we see a lot of people who just don't feel well. And the allopathic system is, very well meaning, I think, but they are very focused on critical care, crisis care. And there's a very appropriate time and place for that. So, if I have a heart attack or break my arm or have some need an emergency surgery, the allopathic system is pretty good at that. That is something I think that is necessary, but the training for that system is basically set to deal with everything that way. And a lot of people don't have a full-blown disease. They just have a lot of dysfunction. They have a lot of inflammation. And that just makes them feel lousy. They have poor energy. Their hormones are imbalanced. They're, you know, not being able to sleep very well. They have anxiety. These are all things that aren't necessarily control or dealt with on the allopathic side, and that the symptoms may be dealt with, but that's all they're dealing with is the symptoms that accommodate that. They're not really looking to the underlying reason why, and trying to balance out that dysfunction. And that's what design clinical nutrition is, and it was a very successful process. But the reason we went in and decided to go to this design clinical neurotrition really started when my son Jacob was diagnosed with autism at about 2 years old. And I had treated other kids with autism, and we did what, if you've ever, done that on the functional medicine side or known anybody, you will certainly hear them talk about balancing out your gut, um, doing detoxifications, and controlling the inflammatory response. All those things are very super helpful. And, I definitely have had children that I've helped doing that, no doubt. But one thing we found that we were doing with our own son is that, I just felt there was something missing, and we started hitting plateaus essentially. And that's when I read a book called Disconnected Kids by Dr. Robert Melillo, and learned something called Melillo method. And that's something certainly we will talk about more in the future. But that started to get to me that, yeah, there's this imbalance in the connectivity of the brain. And certainly inflammation can create some of that imbalance. There's, no doubt that can affect maybe the neurodevelopment. But also what I was, starting to realize, well, just because we get rid of this inflammatory stress doesn't mean the neurology is going to, automatically wire the way it's supposed to. And then I started learning that, hey, the brain controls everything. The brain controls how the gut functions. The brain controls how the immune system responds. The brain controls how we, respond to an inflammatory stress. All that neurology is super important. And if there's imbalances in how the neurology are functioning, then there's almost certainly going to be imbalances in how the physiology that the neurology controls responds. And so that was really an aha moment for me. And once I started realizing these tools I needed to help these kids, I started seeing that some similar imbalances we were starting to see with adults too. And so, I'd see, we'll give examples of, maybe we have people with chronic thyroid issues who, they're not converting their thyroid hormones. So, their T4 levels are great, their TSH is fine, but they still feel lousy because they're not converting that T4 to T3. Well, part of the reason that is because of cortisol. Well, if you're stuck in fight and flight all the time, survival mode, then you're going to pump out that cortisol on a daily basis. So that started making the connection. Hey, we have to deal with both sides of these coins. These are two-way streets. that we have to deal with from both directions, the chicken and the egg. So let's get into some examples of some ways that connecting the physiology and neurology makes sense and a lot of people be probably really familiar with. The gut brain axis is something that a lot of people have become more aware of. And really, where they're becoming aware of it is gut health can relate to cognitive health. So there is definitely evidence. A lot of research has been done in this area here recently, where microflora, knowing how our gut health and microflora balance and inflammation in our gut can impact our neurology. And so we think about food sensitivities, we think about overgrowth of certain microbes like yeast and bacteria and even parasites. And that is totally true. But what is also true is that the neurology impacts that gut in a very similar way. So let's look at the gut brain axis and talk a little bit more specific. Yes, the microflora impact the neurology coming upstream through the vagus nerve, but also the vagus nerve comes downstream as well into the gut itself. And that affects gut motility, that affects even the lining. So what a lot of people call leaky gut. Personally, not a huge fan of that term. It's really, to me, gut hyperpermeability is a better term because, obviously fecal material aren't leaking into our bloodstream. We would have sepsis and die if that was happening. But the idea that certain peptides and proteins are leaking through, creating inflammatory responses, and certain nutrients not being absorbed is definitely a real thing. And that is, kind of describes really what's happening in that scenario of leaky gut. So what's interesting is there's actually a study done on rats, and a little bit of a warning here. It's a little bit brutal, but they essentially took rats and gave them head injuries on purpose. And what they found is after the head injury, these mice actually developed that leaky gut. And so that allowed to create more inflammatory responses that can lead to more autoimmunity. And so we have to consider both things, both ends of that coin. What is really creating this leaky gut? Is it developmental? I think that's something to think about in things like autism and ADHD and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Is that part of it? It just that's that lining that, and that's probably something we will break down in future podcasts is, how that vagus nerve system actually develops. It's kind of underdeveloped when we're born, and so it just doesn't automatically wire on. It does go through that first year of life and needs to be developed properly. And so, you know, is that the reason? Is it, things in our environment? There's some folks out there who will say that things like glyphosate, which is the chemical involved in Roundup, damages our gut lining. There's evidence for that. And, so what comes first, chicken or the egg? And that's when I started realizing now sometimes we treat the gut and see improvement in the system. And sometimes we treat the neurology and see improvement in the system. There's not really a great way to differentiate those two. And that's when it came to treating both. So really kind of a fascinating thing to think about is how, yes, the gut brain axis is an awesome thing, but you can get impacts and actually more powerful impacts, impacting that from either the top down or bottom up. And I've more and more found over time that looking at both is the most successful strategy. So another example I like to talk about is actually hormone balance, things like thyroid, even balance of estrogens and testosterones and progesterones. There are hormones released from the brain. For thyroid, for instance, it's TSH, and that kind of tells the organs how to operate. Well, those organs do work in loops with the adrenal glands, hypothalamus, pituitary, and the brain. And then you also have the vestibular system neurologically that plugs into that. So one thing we see in women who become perimenopausal or even menopausal, a lot of times they'll start getting more dizziness or vertigo, those types of symptoms, which shows there's a weakness within the vestibular system. Now, some evidence says that's because of the hormones getting low that contributes to the vestibular dysregulation. And some people will say, no, that's actually the vestibular dysfunction actually contributes to the hormone imbalance. Again, kind of a chicken or egg scenario, but we can treat both. There are ways to help rewire that vestibular system. So, which came first? Again, so sometimes we see hormones balance out, but that dizziness is still there. So, what does that tell you? Maybe the vestibular system is more at the head of this and it can help stabilize it. And so, these are all things that when we look at this, we have to consider when we look at these different dysfunctions and disorders. So now becomes the question, once we have an understanding of how different conditions can have both a neurological component and a physiological component, how do we test? What do we do to evaluate that and find if there are some neurological parts of this? Where do we go to treat it? Well, there's a lot of great functional tests that we can do. And when you come into our office, one of the first things we're going to do is a set of diagnostic tests. The first one we do is heart rate variability, which is a test where we have you lay down and stand up and you're strapped to a heart rate monitor. And what that allows us to do is how that heart rate changes and how the ratios or the intervals between those heartbeats change can then give us an idea of how your sympathetic, which is your fight and flight system, and your parasympathetic nervous system, which is involved more in sleep, digestion, and repair, how those systems are regulating. The parasympathetic nervous system is actually what we lose as we age. So that is actually part of the aging process, losing that system. So we can see, hey, is that parasympathetic low? Are you neurologically old for your age? Or is there an imbalance in how it's regulating? So is the fight and flight over responding, under responding? All this can tell us different parts of neurology that might be a little imbalanced or weak that can be contributing to what's going on. Another test we do is balance testing. And when we do balance testing, we are really looking at the sensory networks involved with balance. So proprioception is part of balance where you feel your body. Your feet are able to feel the ground. So people with neuropathy, for instance, who lose that sensation of feeling their feet and feeling the ground, that will almost certainly alter their balance. We also look at visual balance. So in that scenario, we have like kind of a foam pad we use, and your eyes are open. And so we're taking away a little bit of that proprioception. And now it's more the visual sensory networks that are creating balance. And then finally, we have the vestibular based balance, which you're on that foam pad, your eyes are closed. And now we have taken away the visual sensory systems. We've taken away the proprioception. And now it's all that inner ear balance, that vestibular system. And then we have other physical exam tests that can tell us more about the vestibular system. But that gives a real good measurement of where the balance is. And then we also there's one more part of that test, which is basically measuring how all those systems kind of work together. So that can quantify it for us so we can know, hey, that's an issue and we can measure it. And, balance, we know now is balance is a great marker for cognitive vitality as we age. So that's a really important thing to look at. The next thing we look at is functional eye movements. Now, this test has nothing to do with, how well you see. So, it's not going to tell us if you have 20/20 vision versus 20/40 vision. But what it's doing is looking at how the eyes track together. So different eye movements are controlled by different parts of the brain. So if I just want to fixate on something, then that's going to be my brainstem. That's where that fight and flight response comes from. That's where things like primitive reflexes emerge from. And then we have pursuit. So that's just smooth tracking, like looking at my finger with just my eyes, not moving my head. And that is looking at the cerebellum, which is more balance and coordination, and the parietal lobe, which is more sensory processing. And then finally, we look at saccades. So those are more, if you think of those, are more rapid eye movements. So looking back and forth. And those are controlled by the cerebellum and the frontal lobe. And frontal lobe is our, executive function, emotional regulation, our attention and motivation. It's all those higher cognitive functions that, frankly, we associate with humans, is those frontal lobes. So that can then tell us, hey, is there an imbalance here? And sometimes it can even tell us, hey, is there more an imbalance for the left or right side of the brain? And that's really important too, because if we're going to strengthen and balance your neurology, we want to balance it in a way that's going to support your weaknesses, not necessarily gear up the dominance and the strengths. We want to create balance with this as well. So we're going to try to evaluate, hey, are you more of a left brain dominant person? Are you more of a right brain dominant person? And that's totally normal to be a left brain or right brain dominant person. Okay. Everyone is. But how big is that imbalance? Okay. If you're here, not such a big deal. But if you're here, you might be a little ADHD. Okay. So, or more prone to anxiety. So, those things matter. And those are the kind of things that we're looking for. So, it's all about creating balance. And then we get into more of the functional neurology, or I'm sorry, functional medicine testing, where we're thinking about, we will run traditional blood work like, your primary care might run, but we're going to look at that a little different. We're going to, first of all, run some different tests. We're going to look at things that look at more inflammation, and then we're going to narrow those normals. I don't think people realize that most normals in your labs are just averages of the population. So if you're an area where obesity is higher and you're more, um, more chronic disease, your a lot of those lab values are going to be kind of skewed, and so you may be not within that optimal range essentially. So we look at optimal values for your traditional lab test, and then we might dig into some more untraditional tests, so like GI maps that map out your entire microflora, look at digestive enzymes, look at a wide variety of parasites and bacteria and yeast that might be creating some inflammation. We look for markers of that leaky gut. We look for markers of inflammation that might tell us, oh, hey, this is a bigger issue like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, something that might need a little bit more aggressive medical intervention. Adrenal stress testing is another test that we look at. Saliva testing that looks at how your cortisol production is. Hormones, saliva and urine, some things that look at those markers a little bit more functionally. And then even genetic testing, which can then tell us, where are your weaknesses, what type of diet that you need to eat to not only lose weight, but to, just be healthier in general. Some people have genetic sensitivities to saturated fats, for instance, where coconut oil, while a superfood for one person, might be deadly to another person with that saturated fat sensitivity. So these are all really cool things that we can kind of put one puzzle piece together at a time to start saying, hey, how do we optimize your health from that comprehensive approach? All right. So let's now talk about, well, okay, we have all this information. We know there might be some imbalances in your nervous system. There might be also these imbalances over here in your physiology. What do we do about them? Well, number one, we got to get lifestyle under control. That's to me the biggest thing. So diet, exercise are critical. And I can tell you what to do. I mean, that's not hard to do, but what's more difficult is implementing it. So for that, we will have you work with a health coach to really dig into, hey, what are the barriers for you doing this? Some people, for instance, food is one of their love languages. Okay. That's how they express affection to each other in relationships. And so if that's the case, that might be a really big barrier for them making significant changes, especially if those changes, I don't always like telling people what the changes are. They're not always easy, okay? Sometimes I look at what I need to tell somebody and I'm like, thank the Lord, I'm not having to tell that to myself because I would struggle with that. And so being able to set goals, make practical application, working with someone to actually implement those goals is, I think, critically important. The other thing we're going to do is balance out those physiology. So alternative health has, natural, there's natural herbals and different clinical nutrients that we can use in right combinations to do some pretty incredible things. So if we need to control inflammation or, help balance out microflora or support those adrenals, the cortisol response, there's so many natural things that are non-pharmaceutical that we use when they're clinically high grade and quality nutrients. So that is something we will use. We will then also get into balancing neurology. So how do we do that? We do balance training. We do red light therapy. Red light therapy is really pretty fascinating. There's actually thousands of studies that just show how it impacts the brain itself. So in the brain, it actually creates what we call neurogenesis and synaptogenesis, which is a fancy way to say new neurons and new connections in the brain. So especially if we know, let's go back and say, hey, we looked at your saccades, those eye movements, and we know they're a little weak. So maybe there's some frontal lobe imbalance on the right side. Well, we can put red light right on that frontal lobe on the right side and improve that functional connectivity and improve the function of that part of the brain. Pretty cool. Vagus nerve stimulation. Now, you may have never heard of that, but you may have heard of things people are doing to stimulate their vagus nerve. Probably one of the most ones that people think to, or at least remember, because it's a little bit extreme, is some of those cold plunges. So when people, get into an ice bath of some sort, that rapid change in temperature actually stimulates that vagus nerve. It can strengthen the function of that nerve. And like we talked about before, that is a key thing to work on for that gut brain axis, for that comprehensive approach. So, yes, you can do it that way. You can also hum, you can gargle, you can sing, you can do deep breathing. That's why deep breathing calms our nervous systems because it activates that vagus nerve. But we can also just do it a little bit more medically. There's devices that we can use to stimulate that vagus nerve through the sensory branches in the ear. There's also vibrational devices we can use, and we like to get people to do it at home because to change the nervous system, you have to have repetition. It's the only way to create what we call neuroplasticity, which is new connections within the brain itself. You have to stimulate it, stimulate it, stimulate it. That's what muscle memory is constant repetition of some sort of activity that then creates a new neural network. That's why you can learn how to ride a bike and not do it for 10, 15 years and get on the bike and it's like you did it yesterday. So to do that, we have to have you do some of this stuff at home. So not only are we going to give you the tools to do that, to stimulate that vagus nerve at home, but we'll also work on balance and proprioception at home too. So home exercises that work that neurology is really important. And then finally, it's following up with these diagnostics. So measuring, making sure your vestibular system, the balance training that we did your vestibular system get better? Okay. Following up with that and then looking at, where are the weakest links? And we might have to do some cognitive testing on that too. Sometimes the balance testing and the eye testing, all that looks really good, but we're still not really sure but you might have like anxiety or other things that, might be truly a hemispheric imbalance, that dominance on one side versus the other. Sometimes that's not always super evident. And we can do cognitive testing even that looks at things like an example would be visual memory versus verbal memory. Those are controlled by opposite sides of the brain. And so we can do testing like that and then say, okay, hey, you're in the 10th percentile for verbal memory, but you're in the 90th percentile for visual memory. That tells me there's this imbalance in your brain, and then we can know we can have to stimulate. That's probably an important thing to stimulate as well. So there's lots of tools and lots of different treatments we can use to change this. So a lot of people think, hey, your neurology is your neurology. My brain cells, I'm just losing a few every day. I'm never going to get them back. We now know that's not true. We know we can create these new connections well into our later years of life. Even evidence saying going into our 80s, we can create some neuroplasticity. So that's a really cool and exciting thing if we know how to apply it. All right, so that is an overview of what design clinical neurotrition is. And I hope this really gives you some insight and a way to think about your health and some of your challenges in a much different way. Everyone, for instance, talks about how stress can impact your health. Well, what we're going to do is show you physically how that is, where there is imbalance that show that harm to your physiology. And then when we change it, then we can offset some of that impact. You just don't have to, meditate and, do stress management, which really is, it's not a bad thing to do. I think it's better than nothing, but it's relatively ineffective for most people. Probably one because they don't do it frequently enough, but also it's, if you are so stressed out and so have so much anxiety that you cannot even get yourself into that point of relaxation, then that's a really hard thing to do. So there are ways to change that. There are ways to offset that feature, but we also need to know if it's part of the picture. So as we go through this, what my goal is, just so you know what this podcast is going to look like in the future here, is I really want to take different conditions, maybe even some different symptoms. We're going to have different guests on here, and we're really going to talk about how the neurology and the physiology are kind of intertwined in what we kind of do about it. So I really encourage you all who watch this to, if you have some suggestions or some things you would really like for me to talk about, or even bring, if it's not something that I'm super, not my exact expertise. Maybe we can have a guest on that can do that as well. So I really want to hear suggestions. So definitely drop those in the comments. And I really thank you for tuning in. I'm really excited to share this revolutionary healthcare model with you. And please subscribe to our channel at Healthy Tallahassee on YouTube. We also will be on Spotify and iHearts and also Apple podcast databases as well. So please subscribe, get those notifications of new episodes. We'll be coming out every 2 weeks. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to optimizing both your mind and your body.